Hey everyone, so today we're going to talk about the role that culture and identity play on behavior and who we are in total. So as far as culture and identity goes, there are several mechanisms that shapes one's identity and as an individual, and culture happens to be one of those mechanisms. And within culture, there are a few further factors that also are at play in contributing to identity development. And we've talked about these in small part before, and those are enculturation and acculturation. And the role that each of these play and the shape that they take within our lives is determined by the ways in which we are socialized, the ways in which we learn the rules and norms of society. So as far as enculturation and acculturation goes, socialization is heavily factored into the role of enculturation. So this is the acquisition of the necessary and appropriate norms and skills for one's own culture of origin. And these are guided directly by parents and later peer groups. Media also plays a role as well, the people around us. All of these greatly contribute to our own personal identity. And this often takes place at deep cognitive levels, which is why often enculturation, even if you live in many other countries after you are enculturated, you keep and hold on to a lot of your original culture. Acculturation, on the other hand, takes place when people change or adapt due to contact with another culture in order to fit in with that culture. And so going to college in another country or even in another part of the United States would change our behaviors and our identity in the process in some way. And so again, enculturation is first culture learning, acculturation, second culture learning. So like I said in the last slide, acculturation often rarely completely replaces the original enculturation, but it does tend to modify it. And most often, enculturation tends to impact us more over the course of our lifetime on both a behavioral and a cognitive aspect. Another way to think about enculturation is in thinking about the idea that cultural transmission is the main mechanism through which enculturation occurs. So these include passing cultural norms like attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs from one generation to the next. So for children, oftentimes this goes through school, modeling from family or friends, observation of those around us. And we've talked about some of those ways and some of those ideas a lot throughout this sociocultural unit. But often how this takes place is often culturally based. And these can come through both active and observational forms. So the first study we're going to look at here is one that looked at and wanted to determine the effect of enculturation on cognition, and that's Demorest et al. From 2008. So they took 150 trained and untrained musicians from the US and Turkey, and they had the participants listen to several novel or new musical excerpts from both familiar and unfamiliar cultures to them, and then completed a recognition memory test to see how well they would remember the music. So what they found was that participants were significantly better at remembering novel music or new music from their native culture. And musical expertise did not necessarily correlate with the results, meaning that even for trained musicians who know a lot, they were more likely to remember new music from their own culture. And so enculturation, in conclusion, really influences musical memory on a deep level and sort of points to how much it influences cognition as well and our schemas for musical information. Right? So that's pointing to something a little bit bigger. So another couple studies that have to do with enculturation include Ash 1956, and then also Berry and Katz, which we talked about, in other lessons. I'm not going to really go through this on any deep level because I feel like we understand these quite well. But if we are looking at the idea of enculturation and we are thinking about these studies, we can go over to Berry and Katz. And so in Berry and Katz, what they found was that collectivism is often associated with higher conformity to group norms. And so they again looked at two different cultures, the Inuit and the Temna. And the Inuit were more individualized, the Temna more collectivist. And based on the enculturated culture, they ended up having very different rates of conformity. And so the Temna, who were more collectivist, tended to conform more than the Inuit culture. And so again, this points to the idea that culture largely shapes our identity and how we interact with the world. If you are from a more collectivist country, you're more likely to possibly conform to other people. From an individualistic country, less likely to. Sorry for my sneeze there. I decided to pause for a second. But again, we're going back to the idea that, again, if you are from a individualistic country, less likely to conform, collectivist, more likely to conform. And that bleeds into those enculturation practices that we looked at. As far as acculturation goes, we've talked about these four different strategies of acculturation before, but just to go over them real quick again. So the first one is assimilation, where the individual strives to adopt the attitudes and behaviors of the majority culture. Then we have integration, where the individual fits with the majority culture, but still maintains the original culture. And then separation, where the individual minimizes contact with the majority culture, but strives to maintain the original culture. And then fourth is marginalization. Individual is excluded from the majority culture and cannot maintain the original culture, so they're sort of stuck without a culture in some ways. And this could be due to situational factors within the new culture, like a language barrier or discrimination. And really what you can get out of those two strategies is the idea that acculturation is not often easy. We seek and desire the company of others, and we are trying to fit in with the environment around us to make things go as smoothly as possible for us. But often, and too often, we can end up in situations where things like social activities are not available to us, especially when we first move to a new place. And so what this can create is acculturation stress. And this is, again, the psychological strain of striving to adapt to a new or different culture. But sometimes we can avoid this stress through activities within the original enculturated culture, like Irish American clubs, German American clubs, Mexican American clubs, whatever you will. And when acculturation does prevent stress, this can often lead to just simply choosing to integrate and assimilate, which can, again, create a generational divide within the family, such as when children who were born in a certain country that were different from their parents start to present new forms of culture and new identities different from what their parents are used to. And again, there are some limitations to acculturation research. Ideally, one would like to conduct longitudinal studies when researching acculturation, as it takes a long time to acculturate. But the number one thing that presents this is money, right? It costs a lot to do that sort of research. And so, another limitation of this research would be that research should also take into account changes within both the minority individual and the dominant culture as well. This can be sort of hard to control on a lot of different levels. And another few limitations, a common method is self-reporting, where the person talks about their own beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. This can lead to bias, and it does lend itself to a correlational design, which limits the scope of cause and effect relationships. Also, much of the acculturation research is biased in one direction, because most migration occurs from poorer countries to richer countries, so you're not only seeing a difference in terms of where they're living, but also in terms of socioeconomic wealth potentially. Most migration also occurs from traditional societies to more liberal societies, and then migration in the opposite direction is not and rarely studied due to a lack of samples because of that. But we're going to look at a particular study called Ishizawa and Jones. This is from 2016. And what they wanted to do was to compare obesity rates among second and third generation Asian migrants to the United States and identify potential moderating factors for developing obesity in these cases. So it was a correlational study studying, again, Asian migrants to the United States. And what they found was that second and third generation migrants had a higher rate of obesity than first generation migrants or people from their country of origin. However, oftentimes there were two moderating factors against developing obesity. One was to live in a neighborhood with a lot of other migrants. So if you lived in a neighborhood that was very similar to yours, this tended to eliminate some of the effects of this acculturation stress. Because really that's what we're looking at when we're looking at obesity here. Obesity is a symptom or an effect of stress. And the other factor was living in a household that retained the original language. And so keeping those roots tied to the enculturated culture led to less stressful environments. So the conclusion was that retaining some ties with the original culture served as a protective factor against developing obesity, developing stress as well in migrants, especially second and third generation migrants. And there's a few things that we can look at as far as evaluation points. There is a strength in that knowing what factors can potentially protect migrants is practical because we can enhance those protective factors to create healthier populations. So in those situations, making sure that people or allowing people and making people more comfortable with holding on to those original roots is a huge thing. The study also must continue to identify, though, other potential factors, as the lower rates of obesity in home countries is not quite enough to sort of show this potential connection there. All right, so the last concepts that we're going to talk about today are ones that are sort of hard for a lot of students to understand. So I want to make sure that we do get this. So this is the idea of emic and etic perspectives. And this is built on the idea that a lot of researchers in Western psychology have looked for universal behaviors, but they're also taking for granted that their findings apply, if their findings apply to humans worldwide. And so it sort of highlights a difference in approaches that could be possibly used towards their subjects for psychological researchers. So the Emic approach is when we view behaviors across cultures, right? We tend to attempt to find out if specific behaviors are culturally determined or universal. The Emic approach, on the other hand, views individual behavior from the standpoint that it is culturally specific, right? And so Emic is looking for worldwide. Emic, sorry, is looking for culturally specific, right? So a bigger piece of the pie for Emic, and Emic is looking at behaviors as if they are specifically attuned to that one culture. So the Emic approach, again, is guided by the following principles. The first one is that human behavior is fundamentally universal. It's not culturally specific. There is an assumption that cognitive and emotional psychological mechanisms are generally similar between each person. It's also deductive. Research is conducted according to the theory, and I'm sorry again for my underlining talents. And then also, it's also deductive in terms of the methods of the investigator's culture and then applied to a local culture which may or may not be similar. On the other hand, Emic approach, again, views behavior as if it is culturally specific. It takes the particularist approach in that a behavior is particular to that particular culture. It's also inductive. It determines what research questions are to be investigated only after getting to understand the culture of the local people. And it could also pave the way for a local specific application to enable people to give more assistance to strangers needing help, and may also build up trust between the researcher and the subject. But very few studies in total are truly Emic, as it tends to be limited in scope to the community being investigated. And it's also very costly because you're basically creating theories for those particular people and spending more time to be able to build up some of these research processes. All right, with that being said, if you have any questions on the Emic approach or enculturation and acculturation, and in total how culture affects our identity, please let me know. Other than that, please everyone have a great day.